Good morning, afternoon, etc. Welcome to SIG Architecture for Thursday, January 18th, 2018. This is our regular scheduled meeting as opposed to the office hours version. And the agenda and notes will be available after this meeting at http://bit.ly/sig-architecture. And I am your co-host along with Brian Grant. And we are going to go into the agenda and knock some stuff out today. So first thing on the agenda was just a quick review on action items. I don't want to go through these unless somebody has something to add. So if your name is there and you did something, speak up and then we'll move on to the next thing.
Yeah, there hasn't been a huge amount of progress. I reviewed all those docs yesterday and today, this morning. I think we're following up on some of the legal issues with the new repo process, for example. We had discussed stripping that doc down to just goals and the overall idea that we would have these three flavors of repos. And since that discussion, there have been zero changes to the doc. So, so there's been no progress on that one. Aaron has been working hard. Aaron did make all his comments on some of the automation impact, and so did Eric Feda. So we definitely need to stay in sync with the SIG contributor experience on the automation implications of the mechanics of whatever we decide to do. And that will require some investigation. There are some options. For example, this morning I was playing with repo topics, which is a newer feature of GitHub that didn't exist like 6 months ago at least. And so we could organize repos within an org using that mechanism. So that's a motivation for splitting between the overall idea of having just these multiple categories and specifying the goals, and then let some other people do investigation figuring out the most feasible way to achieve those goals. There's a discussion on the recommendations regarding CLAs and whatever that I've started with the CNCF. The cloud provider KEP did get merged. So that, I guess that is the one bit of concrete progress. The PR that changes some of the KEP language is still open. It's not clear. I mean, again, after our discussion last time, there were no updates to it. So it's kind of, it's stalled. I'm pretty sure we had discussed a number of concrete things like changing some of the names of the KEP states and things like that. None of those comments were propagated to the PR and no changes.
They're actually in there, Brian.
Really?
Yeah, so I changed it from, oh shoot, maybe I just didn't push. Damn it.
I looked at it this morning.
They're sitting on my machine is what they are. I'm like, I mentally checked it off. All right, I'll do that now because they are sitting on my machine.
All right, thank you. Clayton is, anyway, that's the information on the action items there. The API review process is something that we had talked about picking up again. Clayton sent out a document which was more about the whys than the hows. So I do think that is something we should try to make progress on, pick up. Some of the concrete design details were removed from the KEP template, which I think is fine. But we are going to have a greater level of detail that we ask for as part of API change proposals. So that needs to be part of the review process. And Phil had a PR that had some of that in there, and we could pick that up again and start iterating on that.
I think it might be a reasonable idea to have sort of a variation of the template for certain types of KEPs, like if there's an API, or like have a section that people can paste in for things like APIs, right? Because there are going to be there's this tension between having like 37 different sections of which like 20 are optional, which is kind of overwhelming for folks, versus having a simple looking getting started. And then it's like, well, if this applies to you, sort of like pull in this section here type of thing. So I don't know. I didn't think about the architecture of how we try and keep this.
I was thinking they would be in separate files, just logistically, the additional content that you would pull in. So we just like link out. If you have this type, please include content from this other doc. If you have this type, please include this content from this other doc. Rather than trying to use formatting magic to hide them or something like that. So especially since we talked about having the API reviews in this meeting, there seemed to be some urgency level of interest or urgency in getting that going. So I would like a volunteer for someone to pick that up and dust it off. Phil is not here today, and Clayton is not here today because I didn't put this on the agenda early enough. But we can maybe follow up by email.
So yeah, so I did push that stuff, it turns out. I'd love for you to take another look, Brian, and let me know what you think is missing. Specifically with the sort of states, we moved to accepted, implementable, implemented, deferred, rejected, withdrawn, and replaced as the states, right? So there is no approved states. It's like either accepted, which means that the SIG has said, yes, this is something that's worth working on. Okay. Implementable is like, okay, we feel like there's enough data here that people can get started. Implemented is like, okay, it's pretty much done. We might sort of do some historical updates and sort of like, but it's run its course.
I see. I must have had some kind of refresh problem then.
Yeah, no, because when I first looked at it, I thought I forgot to push also. So it should be, so take a look, let me know what you think. I think it's all approved. I listed you, since this is a KEP and we should try and use the KEP process for the KEP, I think I listed you as an approver for this. So I would really love to get your LGTM on it. And then like, we don't have to do it this time, but we can do another PR where we move it into the sort of implementable stage or something like that, because this is ready for people to start trying it.
Okay, yeah, I'll LGTM it right now. Those are the states that we had discussed, and I'm fine with that.
And then Aaron, the tide check says just not in tide pool, but I have no idea why or what I need to do to fix that.
It didn't have LGTM on it.
We're working on making that more informative. That's on somebody's plate, but not in tide pool means you don't have one of the requirements. So it could be if there are tests they're not passing, or you don't have all the required labels.
I think it's the LGTM, but Tim actually did a /LGTM and then he put a comment after it. So maybe the LGTM parsing is a little bit different, or
yeah, it clearly didn't get picked up by the bot because there was no bot action on that.
Yeah.
After that.
So anyway, it might be worth taking a look to see sort of what happened there, because I'm kind of confused on why like this probably should have been merged at this point, or at least according to the
the command was not well formed.
The Tim's LGTM.
Yes.
Yeah, but it should be merged by now. I don't know.
I use
that. I want Brian's LGTM anyways on it, so
it doesn't count.
no harm, no foul.
It's literally just GitHub queries. So if it's got the right labels on it, however they got there, it should be fine.
Okay.
So you can follow up.
Cool.
Okay, so I wanted to talk about the backlog. Let me see if I can present screen share. This one. Can people see that?
Yes.
Okay, so I started to just edit the backlog here a little bit. So we are continuing to work on iterating on the KEP process and discuss how to roll it out. The new repo process is also under discussion. It's evolved a little bit, I think, in a positive direction. Initially, we said that SIG Architecture would be approving new repos. We still need to develop that process for any repos that are going to get into core and the new stratification of different categories of repos. They're the associated repos, the SIG repos where SIGs can decide, and the core, so-called core repos, which would be those in the Kubernetes org, where it'd still be up to SIG architecture to say, yeah, that's in scope for Kubernetes or not. So as part of that,
Brian, can I ask a quick question here, though? You said the ones in the Kubernetes org will be the ones that are core. Is that a one-to-one correlation?
So it's not the ones that are currently in the org. So I guess a couple of caveats. One is that it's not the ones necessarily that are currently in the org. Another is we're still actually figuring out what the optimal GitHub mechanics are for the current GitHub functionality. It may be that we need to use topics or something else instead to distinguish the different flavors. But one possible implementation of the proposal would be we just have one org instead of incubator. We have one org for all the SIG-related repos, and we tag them with which SIG owns them, and then a separate org, the Kubernetes org, for the things that are considered core for whatever that means. That's one possible implementation. I don't know that it will be the implementation, but the basic idea is we want to categorize the repos, and we'll have the most stringent requirements in terms of consistency and governance and oversight and whatnot on the core repos. We're still also trying to define what that should really mean. Is it just things that go into the release bundle that the project ships, or is it more inclusive? So a bunch of those things need to be figured out. But the basic idea is, if SIG architecture owns kind of the definition of what Kubernetes entails, then it would make the decision, yeah, that's included. But we don't want to stop SIGs from building the things they need or from innovating. So this new proposal would explicitly delegate that decision level making to the SIGs. Now there's still some governance issues, like who in the SIG can decide how are those decisions made. And that's an issue that needs to be addressed across the whole project and even in SIG architecture. So that kind of got blocked, that process got blocked behind a little bit on the definition of sub-projects and owners, which Aaron and I are working on in the context of the steering committee to sort of formalize that notion so that we can have more specific areas with more specific people who own those areas. But that gets down into the SIG-related part of the backlog where we need to make some progress on how this SIG should operate, and ideally it would be something that other SIGs could potentially adopt parts of or something like that. So fleshing out the things that we believe should be in the charter. Right now the charter has articulates the scope of the SIG pretty well, I think, but it leaves out things like how are SIG leads chosen and how are decisions made and things like that, or what subprojects are specifically fall under the SIG. How are those organized?
Brian?
Yeah.
Can I go back to the repo thing for 1 minute? Because there's a sort of urgent matter that's going to come up soon that's going to block a lot of work, which is the cloud provider working group has decided to have repos in the Kubernetes org per the entry cloud providers. So essentially entry cloud providers would be moved up to their own repos under the Kubernetes org. So
right.
It falls under neither a SIG nor under us. It's sort of this weird cruft that doesn't have a good home, but also needs to be under the auspices of the same workflow as other parts of the org. So
as a logistical matter, as a next step, I think that's reasonable. It falls under the existing grandfather rule of if you move code out of the Kubernetes repo, you can stay in the Kubernetes org, at least for now.
Okay.
So
good.
Repos are relatively easy to move, so I'm not concerned about that.
Sorry, this is Tim. I'm off camera. There's a medium-term plan to get the cloud providers to just ingest those themselves and not keep them in the Kubernetes org anymore, but we need to work through the copyright, whatever hurdles, assignment in that, not copyright, but all the licensing stuff.
Right.
So we just haven't tackled that yet. We just said it's much easier to just get things out as step one. It's clearly obvious that there's a hard boundary then, and we deal with the next bridge when we get there.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds good.
Yeah,
Okay.
actually, due to related issues that have come up in the new repo process, I did some investigation on booting things out. It's actually reasonably straightforward. Effectively, it becomes like a fork. Even if we just transfer the whole repo to them,
right.
They would leave the existing copyright notices, boilerplate and whatever, and plaster a new one above it, and put their own CLA or DCO or whatever in place. The existing license and things would just remain, so it's kind of similar to vendoring.
That seems obvious and correct. Was that Google legal or CNCF legal?
The latter.
Great, awesome. Then I'm happy to hear that, and we'll put that in the portfolio of steps on the working group.
All right, thanks. Sorry to derail things, but that's just coming up hot right now. So
it's a good one because that doesn't fall under any one SIG.
Right.
Right. So documentation, there were a number of discussions leading up to KubeCon and probably even earlier about updating the definition of what Kubernetes is on the website. So that's kind of on the table. I would like to get back to the architecture diagrams. At some point, I created a doc with a backlog of design decisions that have been made but not documented. So I'm adding a link to that in the official backlog here of things to do. Along those lines right now, for people who aren't aware, there is a discussion right now about whether the daemon set controller should continue to be a scheduler. So that discussion started in SIG scheduling. I actually can't see the chat with this thing up. But anyway, I've shown most of the backlog here, so I'm going to stop sharing for a sec. So people who are interested in that discussion, take a look. It affects multiple parts of the project. And one, the daemon set controller currently is nominally owned by the workloads API effort under SIG Apps. But the implications of changing whether daemon sets is a scheduler or not have kind of serious architectural implications to multiple components in the system, including the scheduler and the daemon set controller and kubelet, and whether the system can support multiple schedulers at all. So that discussion is underway, but it's clear there as just one example of why we need to document how the design of the system is intended to work, including the division of responsibilities among the components and things like that, because it's easy for these properties to erode over time if they're not documented and not tested.
Well, I don't think the properties of this have been, there's a conflation because there's a specific set of problems that kind of cause this to occur. When we start evaluating priority and preemption, that's when daemon set starts to break down a little bit in its current form, and where the boundary lines of who does what become fuzzy, right? So it's not clean or clear. That's the reason why we're having this conversation.
Well, yeah, and it's not just daemon set, it's any replacement scheduler or additional scheduler as well. And having daemon set in the system as a second scheduler just exposed those issues earlier than they otherwise would have been, which I think is one of the main values of keeping it as a scheduler, honestly. So anyway, is there anything else that people feel is important in the backlog? And does anybody have opinions on priorities in terms of things we should tackle next other than the API review process.
Actually, I had a related but perhaps not as substantial question, but maybe I'd get out of the way. Someone came up yesterday with an idea, I forget even the details of it, but it was an idea for something that seemed reasonable that we should do it, but they didn't want to write a KEP because they weren't actually committing to do the work. They just want to put it somewhere so that we consider it and solicit community involvement. Is issues still the right place for that? Is proposals the right place for that? I sort of hate proposals that are opened and approved, but nobody's working on. I'm just curious what we think the right process is for that now.
I think one of the things that I like about the Rust RFC process is that you don't necessarily have to be the implementer of an RFC. You can work on outlining the problem that you're trying to solve, and then just checked into source control once there is agreement that it's a reasonable thing to work on, so you don't have to, lose it or anything.
But is there a way to tell those from the ones that people are working on? Like the help wanted label, as much as we don't curate it, is actually a really easy way to tell people, go look here for ideas of things to work on.
We have had some proposals merged in the past that were unstaffed, and then nobody ever worked on them. And yeah, there's no good way to find those things. Even if we would like to have it done, there's always competing priorities and things like that to get them to have enough review bandwidth, or often refactoring is required, which may interfere with other work that's ongoing. So I think if it's significant enough to require a proposal, but it's not high enough priority for someone committed to do it to actually do it, then it's not clear how valuable it is. Maybe an issue is fine, although we're going to get pinged by the bot now every quarter for those things that are still open. I think the ecosystem is big enough now that people can write their idea in a blog post or something like that, and then somebody else can implement it completely outside the project.
Okay. I mean, personally, I'm a big fan of using issues as backlog, and some of these ideas, like I'm remembering the details now. It was substantial but not enormous. I have a terrible memory. I will forget about it if it's not somewhere in an issue. I know that we have a problem with creeping issues.
Well, we have a problem with still having 5,000 issues, which makes
about 45 days we'll have half as many if Betabot gets his hands on it.
Yeah, but anyway, I mean they're pretty much undiscoverable. Even if we cut down the number of issues to 1,000, it's not going to be discoverable.
We also don't categorize well. Like we never provided a label for like this is just an idea, not a bug.
We do. We have there should be. We have a couple of labels that would be appropriate for that, but they're not curated.
So we could start curating, or we could just say this is file your ideas in your own headspace, and that's it.
Some projects have like a repo for ideas or something like that. Like GitHub even recommends now as part of their how to use GitHub manual to create separate repos just for separate categories of issues. Like don't file issues to your code repo, file them to an issues repo of whatever different flavor.
Do we like that idea? I mean, we sort of have it with proposals.
We have it with features.
Yeah, but never we end up liking features.
I don't know.
The KEP process is a baby process, so I really hate to sort of overload it with more stuff before we really have a feel on it. I think it's compatible. I mean, like, I definitely see that there's a duality here between issues and documents on this, especially just because this is kind of a sort of create one thing and throw it off and make sure it doesn't get lost type of thing.
And also, I mean, issues have the side benefit of you can actually have a conversation about an issue where you can't have a conversation about a checked-in doc.
Right, unless you're going to change the doc, right, and then you have a discussion about the change, which I think is probably appropriate for KEPs because you want to have focused discussions around that. But ideas, it's something that's just very much in that ideation stage.
This is in the category of things where I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but superficially, it doesn't seem like a terrible idea. Nobody's going to work on it right now, but I would love to see somebody write it down so that somebody else could finish it if they wanted to.
The thing we have for that is issues in the Kubernetes repo.
Okay, so I mean that was my first instinct, but I wanted to check if we had something more formal. And like if we like the ideas repo, I'll create an ideas repo and file it.
I mean, so one thing that we could. So I mean, you think ideas repo, and then we do issues in the ideas repo?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it's
FetaBot will still catch them though.
It's just for preformed ideas that will eventually become proposals.
Yeah.
So what's the difference between creating another repo and doing that and tagging them in the Kubernetes repo as an idea? What's the difference between the two?
The difference is that we have like 150 labels and people don't know to filter by which label to find these things or which labels to apply when they file them.
So when you create a new repo, though, on the Kubernetes org, I think you automatically get all the labels, right? Because we make them consistent across everything. But FetaBot still does it. So you're still going to have all of those labels on this new org, and FetaBot's still going to come through and close stuff that's stale.
We can tell FetaBot to ignore a whole repo.
Yeah, I mean, the vast majority of those labels won't be relevant. Like someone who files an issue won't have to apply a label to get it discovered.
But so I guess I'm still having trouble because all the confusing labels will still be there on this new repo because that's automatic. What?
Daniel's point about people won't open them against the right repo. Like we have that issue today, right? We've got a repo for kube control issues and one for federation issues, and people still constantly open against the main repo. And so it's a constant stream of opening and then closing, saying, please open against this other repo. Which is okay.
Yeah,
I agree with you on that. Like DNS is the same exact boat.
Yeah. So, I mean, we just need to decide what we want. Like if we are going to tell people this is not where these issues go, open them there, we need to do it consistently because we have a huge mishmash of things we already have separate repos for tracking issues in that we aren't doing a good job of redirecting.
I'm fine with using Kubernetes. Kubernetes is the central repo. I have a feeling that over time, there will be less and less actual meaningful code in there, and more it becomes the meta repo. But I'm fine. I think probably the simplest path is just open it, tag it as whatever kind idea, maybe put the word idea at the front of the label, and we can consider whether we want FetaBot to ignore idea posts.
So one thing that we can do, and as we start, and this is something I'm working with the Contribex folks around, is as we start getting more of a community portal where we can actually, like, we could have links to sort of standard GitHub queries for these types of things. Sort of like, oh, you want to see all the ideas, here's how you go. You want to see all the stuff in this milestone, here's where you go, right? I think some of it is that we don't have standard queries that people use against these labels. So everybody makes their own. And so then it's like, well, there's this mishmash. But if we have like, here's the 5 queries that start slicing and dicing stuff, that might help steer people in the right direction.
But yeah, so how would, we can figure out the exact labels later, but we already have labels for feature requests and for cleanup suggestions and for a bunch of things like that. There's a big disparity between how well fleshed out some of the
There are currently only 3 kind labels that are supposed to be propagated across all repos. I think it's bug, it's bug, docs, and feature. If we greatly reduce the number of kind repos that are used uniformly across all repos, I don't think it would be that confusing, and it would help a lot with dev stats, where some of the dashboards already like fragment based on the kind labels.
Feature is not a terrible fit for this.
I mean,
sometimes people file feature requests saying, "Hey, it'd be great if Kubernetes did this," and then other people file those saying that, and then they have 10 pages about how to design it and implement it.
Yeah, I think it's reasonable for there to be a spectrum of completeness of ideas. I mean,
yeah. Anyway,
file because I don't want to forget something I actually want to design.
So Aaron, so I mean, this is kind of a tooling consistency question, but like, let's say that we have those 3 types of kinds. Different repos are going to want to have their own sort of labels, but we also want to have standardized tools for querying and finding this stuff.
That's fine. This is why I was trying to be really diligent in restricting the labels that are synced across all labels.
Right,
So,
but I think, like, could we do something like, and I'm just wondering if we could build tooling that understands this. I don't know if the GitHub queries understand it, but like maybe like we could use the slash to be more meaningful, similar to like Gmail labels and how they sort of got themselves to folders, so that it's kind slash feature slash idea slash proposal or something like that, where we could let certain repos create subcategories under that, and then
so GitHub queries don't let you use regexes, so that taxonomy really wouldn't be super worthwhile.
Okay.
Like
the tools we build could do it, but other tools wouldn't necessarily recognize the relationship, the hierarchy of labels.
Yeah, and it just makes interacting with the GitHub API pretty painful. So like Tide, for example, we've tried to standardize on having a do not merge / prefix for any label that describes why you might not want to merge a PR. But when it comes to asking GitHub, we still have to individually list out every single do not merge label that we are aware of.
I mean, we could make our bots apply the hierarchy of labels. If you specify kind feature foobar, it applies kind feature also.
We could. I'm just questioning the need for such a deep taxonomy. We've gotten by with just 3 kind labels spread across all repos, and then it's not like a subtractive thing, right? Like we don't remove labels that people have added on their own subprojects.
Well, I guess what I'm trying to say, Aaron, is that if we build a standard dashboard that says, okay, let's look at the trend of numbers of issues in this particular repo based on kind, right? Do we want to actually say there's only 3 different kinds, and then there's subcategories under that. It may be easier to build dashboards and toolings if we do get more restrictive about the labels.
That's dev stats, Joe.
I know that's dev stats, but like, is it easier to build better dev stats and get more knowledge out of that if we actually have a more restricted set of labels? That's the question. But I think we're kind of in the weeds now. So.
On the label front, I'd like to point out that we should be careful on how we restrict, because now we're doing process that's not designed to enable people, but designed to help some people do reporting on things. And that could be restrictive to people, right? Are we trying to enable people, or it's just one of those things I want to be careful of. Yeah, the balance of we want to enable, not restrict. I think that's an important thing, because then we'll be seen as restrictors, and that's not good.
All right, I think we're way off.
We're in the weeds. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm gonna give the guidance to file it against Kubernetes, use kind feature, and include the word idea in all caps in the subject, and we can go from there. Fair?
Yes, thanks, Tim. Brian, what's next on the agenda? We got 23 minutes.
So going back to the original question, did anybody have anything else to add to the agenda before I create the PR and self-merge it? The backlog, sorry. Nope.
There was a comment from Dims up in the chat that probably just bears looking at. We don't necessarily have to discuss it unless Dims you want to bring it up, but I thought that was an interesting thing that you brought up.
Yeah, we can do that later.
Okay, great. All right.
Yeah, I mean, that's more of a contributor experience thing anyway.
Right.
Just for my understanding's sake, can you bring the backlog up one more time? I don't see a link to it in chat or something.
Well, yeah, I'll just bring it, share it again, because what I showed was the version I was editing.
Okay.
After the share button. All right. Can you see that?
Yes.
All right.
Yeah, looks good.
Okay, so we should take a look at, so just coming back to the kept process, 1.10 is underway already. I assume people are already starting to file features, issues. Not sure which ones have outstanding proposals or we think should need proposals. Can I get a volunteer for someone to go look at that so we can try to, I think we said we were going to try to apply the KEP process to another couple of things. Is that still in plan?
Yeah, I hate to even volunteer for this, but I will, because I gotta go through that stuff anyway for the 110 release because I'm leading it. So
I think we in the simplified features template, do we have a link to a proposal?
Yeah, there's a link to a proposal, but it doesn't actually say KEP. It just says proposal.
Right. But I'm just wondering if there's a way we could automatically scrape that.
I'll take a look at it, and then I'll report back next week.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so
so the one thing that I think is I'm not sure if it's missing here or if it's out of scope, Brian, is that one of the things that we've been talking about for a while is aligning the people structures with the code ownership, code structures, and building the toolability around that. And there's definitely some overlap here with, the processes and the sub projects and repos and stuff there. I mean, have you thought about sort of how SIG architecture might play a role to help to try and move the ball forward there?
Well, it's a little bit blurry because I wear multiple hats. I actually do that more as a steering committee thing. A combination of steering committee and contributor experience maybe on the tooling side. The sub-projects and owners proposal is the first step.
Yeah.
Then I do plan to go through and enumerate the sub-projects that I think exist and get some feedback from the SIGs on whether they agree or not. But that proposal is my kind of big step in that direction.
Yeah. No, I'm just thinking, is that, maybe that's just out of scope for this SIG.
I think it is.
Yeah. Okay. I'm just trying to brainstorm whether there's a part to play there. I'm not sure. I don't think so, but yeah. Okay. Thanks.
I guess on process, one thing I will add is escalation process. So right now, office hours are kind of being used informally for people to ask for feedback on how they should do things to be aligned with the Kubernetes way, or or with past design decisions, or to follow the API conventions that may or may not be sufficiently clear or documented. But one thing we had talked about is having a more explicit technical escalation process where, if there are issues that affect multiple SIGs or something like that, and they can't come to an agreement, they could request a decision. So I think we said SIG architecture is the most appropriate place for those kind of technical decisions with project-wide impact or at least multi-SIG impact. So it'd be good to have at least some kind of straw man escalation process for that.
I think the prerequisite there, and I think this is on the backlog, it's sort of who's formalizing the decision process, because right now it's like, if somebody escalates to SIG architecture and there's an assumption that they want some sort of final decision, it's already contentious at that point. Having some clear predefined sort of like how decisions get made in this SIG versus just sort of like, hey, it seems like the mob's against you type of thing would be good.
Yep, I agree with that. So for API decisions, I think it's mostly clear, although we should write down the process. And usually it goes to the API approvers, and then it's by lazy consensus.
I'll note I am the one who owns, or I'm trying to get the API review process more documented so I can take the feedback for those sorts of things as well.
But I think part of any process when you have a group of people making a decision, you have to root it also, like, how is that group decided, right? How do you actually sort of maintain that membership? And I think a lot of places there's like, here's the set of folks making decisions, but there isn't that clarity about why are those the folks, or at least how does that group of folks, evolve over time. And I think that's a missing piece in the API review process, at least.
Which was also in my things that I was put in that doc about improving the process to make it clear. You gave that feedback last time, Joe, and I recorded it.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. No, I mean, literally, like.
No, but I think it applies to the SIG, writ large also. So that was kind of my point now.
Yeah. So I also added to the backlog just now, how are SIG leads chosen, which is an issue for every SIG, but.
And that's something we're trying to come up with some default guidance for, out of the steering committee that SIGs can then take and, riff off of, as they find appropriate. So
just real quick, what's the difference between our backlog on how leads are chosen versus what the steering committee is going to do on this?
So the process that we've running through the steering committee, and this is Michelle, Phil, and me who have been sort of, created the subcommittee for like trying to make some progress on this, is understand the range of what works for SIGs, understand the interfaces between those SIGs and the rest of the community, sort of like what are the sort of expected sort of positions to fill and names to name, that type of thing. And then, I think as part of the requirements for the SIG is going to be something, and I'm spitballing here, this is not final, but it's going to be like, they have to have a decision-making process for choosing, the folks that have power. They have to document that, and it has to be sort of fair and equitable, right? Now, there's going to be a set of requirements for a SIG. Now, for a lot of SIGs, it's going to be like, what we have to invent this process out of whole cloth. So I think along with that is going to be like, here's some sort of, reasonable starting place for the SIG to take. And then they can modify that and make it work for them as it makes sense, right? So it's going to be sort of a set of requirements along with, some template docs that you can take if you don't otherwise have opinions or if you're just looking for a place to start. But I don't think that there's going to be, I don't think anybody is saying that, hey, SIGs must operate in this way in terms of what.
No,
does that make sense?
No. I was actually asking because you just brought up what I think steering committee work, and what I was actually wondering is what is the SIG Architecture's role if it's going to go into the backlog here? So what are we doing here in SIG Architecture that's different from the steering committee work? That's kind of where my curiosity was.
It's going to set standards for all SIGs, right? Along with maybe a starting point. There's the decision for this SIG about like, how does this SIG, do they want to, do we want to adopt that as of not yet written sort of template, or do we want to come up with our own process? What is the appropriate thing for this SIG, right? Which is a separable thing from.
Nope, that was all my question was.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly. Okay, so I want to use the last few minutes to work on some of these items. So
I have one other question real quick, if you don't mind.
Okay, sure.
I noticed earlier we were talking about sub-projects and SIGs. When we were talking, one of the things that occurred to me, and repos, one of the things that occurred to me was as kind of the guidance and ideation is happening around this, is anybody engaging with the people who currently own the sub-projects and the sub-repos to collaborate with them based on their experiences so that they have input into the process that they're going to be part of and live under and work with? Is there any of that happening right now?
So to some degree, Aaron has been interacting with some of them as he makes changes to some of the repos. But once I have sort of a straw man draft of some sub-projects, I'm going to start reaching out to the SIGs to get their input and to discuss the concept with them.
Okay.
Right now, I feel like it's not concrete enough to have that discussion, except maybe with one or two SIGs.
Yeah, Matt, and I'm happy to reach out to you to talk about any specific things that SIG Apps has in mind.
No, and part of this is, there's a difference between collaborating to come up with a solution and even having a straw man to start that collaboration and creating something and handing it down. And so my concern is there's certain elements you don't want to have things handed down to them, but want to be engaged in the collaboration that creates something. And so I'm just looking to make sure and asking, how are we embracing that collaboration and bringing people in who do this stuff so that they can be involved and actually share their experiences.
So I'm sort of seeing like a two-pronged approach here where I'm trying to work on technically implementing it in a machine-readable format and making sure that this information is appropriately communicated in all of the SIG's readmes in the community repo. And I think Brian is attempting to iterate on what that content actually is. So what are the sub-projects? And so I think we can have collaboration in pull request format over whether or not the implementation is sound, and we can also have collaboration in whatever format is most appropriate over the content of what are the appropriate sub-projects and who do they belong to. Does that sound fair?
Sure, but I know there's the larger like document on what's core versus what's SIG owned and how do we do that, right?
Yeah, but this isn't necessarily about that, right? This is about making sure that every sub project in any way, shape, or form, whether it's core or not.
Oh yeah. That's not what I'm getting at. I'm actually talking
SIG.
about the process by which we manage repos and choose the categories and what the expectations are on them. Right? Actually engaging the people who are involved in sub-projects and repo ownership around how that should operate.
Okay, so that's sort of a separate effort from this. I would view that more as something that's in line with Brendan's proposal about sort of creating 3 different tiers or classes of repos and saying that depending on which of those you fall under, there's a different set of sort of process and automation guidelines that you are expected to follow, being most stringent and common in core, and then sort of laxing that up as we go to different things. So I'm sort of trying to just pilot how one might go about setting that up for a brand new organization and a brand new repo and documenting it as I go. And then I think we can sort of iterate on what are the guidelines that make the most sense for core repos and how can we lax those going outwards.
Yeah, and what I'm actually asking is when we do this, how are the people who actually own the repos today, manage the sub-projects today, how are they engaged in the collaboration to create that? Is it the steering committee is going to come up with a proposal, they're going to iterate on it, hit up a few people, give feedback, and then hand it down? Or are the people who own sub-projects and manage the repos today involved in the collaboration for giving feedback and discussing it along the way so they have input on their experience and what they think and how it'll affect their process as it's being created? You know, one is some people go off and create something and then hand it to others. The other is a collaboration that involves the affected people during the process. And I'm kind of curious, what's the process on this? Because it's been brought up that some of this is happening, and I'm curious how people who own Minikube and Dashboard and Helm and all of these other things, the people who own and work on them day in and day out are part of the effort that's going to define how things move forward and what's going to be required of them.
So I feel like it would be, correct me if I'm like monologuing here, but I feel like it would be most productive to have this conversation over a document that lays out an initial suggestion from the steering committee, not necessarily a mandate, but a suggestion. And then we can make sure that the appropriate people are reached out to for comment where we can iterate over that proposal. Michelle brought up during the steering committee yesterday the issue that we don't actually have a way of contacting all repo owners or maintainers via email because we just don't have that mapping. GitHub doesn't necessarily give us access to that. And so the way we have today of reaching out to people is either emailing Kubernetes Dev, the mailing list dedicated to developers and contributors to Kubernetes, but that may not necessarily hit people who have decided that's a bucket of noise. And so if we have this taxonomy of sub-projects, tying all sub-projects to SIGs, we do have a mailing list that all SIG leads should be a member of. And so if we reach out to SIG leads, we can make it SIG leads' responsibility to delegate or communicate down to their sub-projects. And so we can make sure that the SIG leads are responsible for making sure that their sub-projects are involved in collaborating in this process.
So I want to interject and, so we can move on because Brian wanted to get to other topics. We talked about this during the steering committee meeting, and there was a general consensus that we need to define a phased rolling policy where we get feedback and iterate on any policies that the steering committee decides or that even get implemented within the larger structure, right? Because it needs to be an iterative process where it's done by 1, then it's done by 2, then it's done by 4, something of that nature, where there's a strategy for how we deploy and implement these processes. So it is part of the conversation. I highly recommend that you watch the video that should have been posted to YouTube because I know other folks did. And if you have a discussion, we can have it on the steering committee list. But right now, that's a policy question And I think I kind of want to move on to the other topics for today.
All right,
Yeah,
thank you.
it's not even a SIG architecture topic, so I think we shouldn't really be discussing that here.
Okay.
Anyway, and we actually burned most of the rest of the time that I had anyway on that. So we had, going back to the action items discussed at the beginning, the KEP and the KEP process. So that ILGTM'd the KEP process. I see Jace LGTM'd my backlog update. So that just got merged. And we'll continue to follow up on those things. Now that Clayton's here, if he's still here, we'll follow up on the API review process. That is, I think, is one of the top priorities, so that we can get those review meetings going and have some kind of addendum to the KEP process that's more specific to API changes. So what are the next steps you plan to take on that, Clayton?
There was a list of recommended changes that need to be made. Most of them involve either capturing existing status, and so I think the most productive thing is to open a small set of PRs that can engender discussion and give a period of time for people to react to that. It would be, I think I've captured all feedback that I've heard from various folks about API review in general, including Joe's comments and the discussion about having a technical meeting. So I was going to open a series of pull requests for capturing the state, and then a series of follow-ons to specifically try to get some of the suggestions moving for changes.
So that's happening on the Google Doc? Is that?
The Google Doc was kind of pulling it all together. I was going to spawn PRs to the concrete documents we have in the community for these, and and I'll add those back and then communicate those to SIG Architecture.
Okay.
There hasn't been any disagreement, not a ton of comment. So I would recommend, if folks do have strong opinions about what should change, please comment on the doc that was shared with SIG Architecture around API review.
So I opened a PR. I put this in the chat, but I just wanted to do an announcement. I opened a PR to move the KEP process from accepted to implementable.
Which merged already.
What's that?
Which merged already.
No. Did it merge already?
Anyway, keep going.
No. This one didn't merge.
Oh.
This is a new one.
Okay.
So this is a way for us to actually sort of like, final read through. Let's make sure that there aren't any sort of like issues that we haven't discussed and heard out. And then I'll let Brian. I'll let you be the arbiter of like, do you think this is sort of settled enough that we can start building tooling and sort of rolling this out in a wider way.
Okay.
So sort of it's a little bit of a last call type of thing. But I think the idea here is that a commit like this where you're just changing it is a good way to sort of get that final sort of cathartic discussion or decision making versus getting in the weeds about all the in-flight stuff along the way.
All right. So I just posted a link to Clayton's Google Doc on the API review to the chat. So the content from Phil's previous PR, I guess earlier we were saying, if we have some template that's specific to API reviews that we want to include in KEPs that involve changing the APIs, that maybe that makes sense to have as a kind of separate document with a link from the KEP process to that for people who are doing API changes. Does that sound reasonable, Clayton?
Yeah, and I think, of everything, I think the number one feedback from API review over the years has been volume and reaching consensus, and then the corollary, or the volume of reviews and the amount, and then the corollary that has come up repeatedly in releases that it trails towards the end of a release process. And so, like we said for other comments, scaling, making that process more efficient in the short term, and more transparent to a larger push across the project is probably going to be the most practical improvement we can make.
Okay, we had also talked about having like an API change freeze date as part of the release process.
Yeah,
Is that
was in the terms of things dropping till, so right now, I think somewhere, and I don't have exact numbers, I'm just making up statistics, but something like 85% of API changes get approved in the last 2 weeks of a release, which is not a good process.
No.
that's after feature complete or before?
Yeah. It's pretty bad. And I think I want to do a little bit of quantifying, but I don't have the data gathering. So that may be another follow-up, is to do a little bit better job tracking when these things are getting actually approved.
So I don't know if that's bad, because people are often moving their API, like they've gotten it to beta and then they make a change that copies it over to beta.
No, these are the things that I see, and like maybe Jordan, if you want to pipe up, like there's a huge surge of last minute, oh, there's this huge redesign of this API. Maybe not like not API, not like the more like traditional like API management, but like I have this feature, it went really late, it's really important for this release, it's in the features repo, I didn't either know or I didn't implement it until feature freeze, and I've got this massive PR, and can you just go through this process? Like that's what I'm most concerned about.
Yes, and I Clayton, like you and Brian, like we all get pounded by this in the last 3 weeks of the release. This December, everybody took a vacation and left me alone. So that's part of what spawned my email about maybe we should actually have a regular meeting for this. I also think that a deadline during the development cycle to say, like, if you think you're going to make an API change, you have to have a proposal and a sketch in place by the first half of the design of the window. Just make numbers up. You have to have it in by the first half. You can tweak on top of that if you have to, and you can come back for sort of re-review to show us the deltas and explain why. But if you don't get your API change in the first half, you just don't get it in.
But it sounds like at minimum we shouldn't be violating our own current policy, which is to take major features and changes after the feature complete deadline.
Yeah, I think that's really key. Is this should not be a kludge to prevent really large features from landing really, really, really late in the release. And like those things have to be spread back out, and that has to be addressed. This is a good way, though, of tracking. I would expect API review to be busiest during the last 4 weeks of a release. And
but I expect those to be small deltas.
Yeah, be more structured about it. Like, hey, we know that just human nature will always lead us into this.
So we're over time. So let's follow up on the mailing list about the next steps. Just so that, because FetaBot is DOSing my communication so badly, just when I thought I was close to having it under control, it's totally out of control again. So it's horrible, but if you can just post links to the PRs and whatnot to the mailing list, that will help me find them.
All right, thanks everybody, and see you next week.
Yep, thank you.
Happy Thursday.